Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to discuss something that seems to be rather big misconception within the Dragon Ball fandom, and that would have to be regarding Dragon Ball Super, and more specifically, when exactly in the timeline of events does Dragon Ball Super take place? Because I've talked to many people over the years since Dragon Ball Super first debuted in 2015, and many of them have been asking that same question. And a lot of them seem to believe that Dragon Ball Super currently is a sequel to Dragon Ball Z and the Dragon Ball manga. But is that actually the case? Well, let me bring up the Dragon Ball manga, and we'll be discussing that right now, and I'll be giving you an exact time of when Dragon Ball Super takes place relative to what Toriyama wrote. So let's get into that right now. So in terms of timeline placement, we have nowhere better to look than the manga that Toriyama himself wrote before the events of Dragon Ball Super taking place. And that would be right here at the end of the fight between Goku and Kid Buu. Of course, as we know, Goku is able to defeat and obliterate Kid Buu, the most powerful villain that they had faced up until that point in the story, with the power of the Spirit Bomb, all of his friends helping him. And then, of course, at that point, what happened? They decide to keep Buu alive, the fat one that is, and decide that within 6 months of this event taking place, they would then be wishing away everyone's memories of this being of Fat Buu, as his name, obviously suggests, because he's very rotund, and making it so that he could live amongst the living, because he at that point was redeemed. He was a good person, or a good being, and he was friends with Mr. Satan, the supposed savior of the earth. At this point, what do we see? Well, everyone's reunited. They all, at this point, get together, explain what happened with Buu, and eventually, 6 months later, they wish away Buu's memory, as Toriyama wrote right here. And so Hercule becomes the savior of humankind once again. Of course, 6 months later, the public's memories of Buu are erased, but still, people remember that Hercule saved them from something. And 10 years later, so 10 years after the fight with Kid Buu, what happens? Well, we see that Kid Trunks from the main timeline is now grown up. He goes to visit Gohan at his home. We see Gohan is now a grown-up scholar. And we also get this whole thing about the 10 years later, which we see the aged Bulma. We see Vegeta, Goku, an older Chi-Chi, Mr. Buu, the aged Goten, Trunks, as well as Bra now being a kid. We see Mr. Satan is a good amount older, looks at 2. Same thing with the dog. Krillin, 18. Everyone here, as you could see, except for Master Roshi, Piccolo, and the 2 Saiyans, look notably older and different than they do in Dragon Ball Super. At this point, Goku's training with Goten. We see that Bulma is a little bit older, and she mentions this entire 5 years that they haven't seen each other within, because Goku's been off on training trips. At that point, we learn about how there's a great fighter who's going to show up at the World's Martial Arts Tournament. Goku and friends go there, and we are introduced to Oob, the reincarnation of Kid Buu. This is what leads to Goku fighting him. At this point, when he fights him, they get into a massive battle, and what occurs? Well, Goku decides your power is really good, however, you don't know how to use it yet. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. I'm going to come live with you, we're going to fly off, and that is the end of the Dragon Ball manga story. But notice how none of this has happened in Dragon Ball Super as of yet. Goku has not directly met Oob, even though he was shown in the arc with the Tournament of Power. And of course, he was even shown in the end of the Moro arc when they're also utilizing the power of the Spirit Bomb. So why exactly has that not been shown? Well, because the fact that Dragon Ball Super actually takes place between these 2 points right here, between the end of the Buu saga, where Goku defeats Kid Buu with the Spirit Bomb, and this point right here in the manga. Dragon Ball Super fits between pages 209 and 210 of Dragon Ball's manga, volume 26 of Dragon Ball Z. So that is to say that Dragon Ball Super actually is not a sequel to Dragon Ball Z. Because the thing is, if it was a sequel to Dragon Ball Z and the Dragon Ball manga, as we could see right here, then it would have to take place after this event in which Goku fights against Oob. But it doesn't. all the events actually take place years before this, with the start of Dragon Ball Super taking place sometime after the 6 months in which, after they wish away Fat Boo's memory. In the original Battle of Gods movie, that was the first version of that. It was about 4 years after this event with them wishing away Boo's memory and the defeat of Kid Buu. And then, of course, Resurrection F was about a year after that. And then different arcs after that, you could piece together how long it took for the Dragon Balls to come back, for them to get their different wishes. And up until the point of Dragon Ball Super Superhero, that takes place 1 year before this, before the 10 years and really 6 months after the defeat of Kid Buu, when we see all these events unfolding, when everyone goes to this tournament, and of course, when we're introduced to Oob, Goku's apprentice, the disciple of the main character, the one who jumps back and forth, especially in the Buu saga, and also the reincarnation of Kid Buu, and now with God Ki and Hollowification and Shinigami powers and everything else that they're going to throw at him, Curse Mark and, all the different techniques like Nen and stuff that they're going to give him to try and make him relevant because, he's a trillion times weaker than everyone else in Dragon Ball Super. But I digress. The point of the matter is that Dragon Ball Super is actually what is referred to as an interquel. An interquel is something that takes place between 2 points in the story. So, for example, it takes place between the end of the Kid Buu fight and the, of course, fight against Oob and the end of this manga that I was just showing you here. That is what an interquel is. It's not a prequel because it doesn't take place before the entire story, nor is it a sequel because it doesn't take place after the story. That actually is Dragon Ball GT. GT is a sequel to Dragon Ball Z and the Dragon Ball manga at this point because it takes place at least 5 years after this 10 years after, which means it takes place about 15-ish years after the fight with Kid Buu. 5 years after Goku started to train Oob, although if I remember correctly, they never say in GT how long it's been, but it's supposedly 5 years, whereas in the English dub, I'm pretty sure they say 10. A lot of the reason because of these two characters here, Bra and Pan, because there's a lot of weird stuff that happens with them, especially if they're supposed to be 9 and 10 years old in Dragon Ball GT. But nonetheless, that's a sequel. Dragon Ball Super is not. So with that being said, in terms of the timeline placement, Dragon Ball Super takes place during the 10 years between the end of the Kid Buu fight and the 10 years later when Goku meets Oob. And the entire story has been slowly, incrementally going up and up and up and up, closer and closer to that end of Z time period, as fans call it. Now, the thing is that Dragon Ball Super did have to make retcons, especially a big one about it even existing during this 10 years of supposed peace that we're told, which I talked about in another video you could see in the cards and on my channel, the biggest retcon in Dragon Ball Super. Additionally, another thing with regard to Dragon Ball Super is that this actually, when it comes to a narrative, has for many people actually been a detriment, because the fact that when we know that a story is taking place before another point in the story, well, is it ever going to really have the tension that another story set after that point could have? Because, as we know, the end of Dragon Ball Z is still canon, it's still going to happen. They still even reference it throughout Dragon Ball Super to kind of foreshadow Oob and Goku training him. They flat out have Dende tell Goku about this. And so, as a result, what ends up happening, we know that everything's going to be fine, no matter what multiversal threat they might be encountering, no matter what other villains might pop along, what tension, what stakes, what supposed changes may occur. We know that all these characters are still alive at the end of the story when Goku meets Oob, so it takes away all of that real tension that the other Dragon Ball series had, which Dragon Ball Super is pretty much bereft of at the time of this recording. Because there definitely is a chance that in the future, Dragon Ball Super will go past the end of Dragon Ball Z. I mean, they're so close, why wouldn't they at this point? And then it finally will become, in that section of the story, a sequel to Dragon Ball, the manga, and Dragon Ball Z. And I have a video coming out very soon with Geekdom 101, in which we're going to talk about the 5 things that we do and the 5 things that we don't want to see at the end of Z. So make sure to check that out when it comes out on our channels, and make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future. Don't forget to share this video out with everyone who might be confused about this, and let me know your own thoughts down below.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.